Welcome to our video series, Data Act Unlocked. In this series, we provide a concise overview of the most important provisions of the EU Data Act. In this episode, we will take a look at data access. We will take a look at the obligations that manufacturers have to adapt their products and how the user's data access rights are regulated. In the last episode of our series, we explained the fundamental idea behind Chapter 2 of the EU Data Act. According to this, data generated through the use of a product is assigned to the user. In order to implement this assignment and ensure that users have access to and can use their data, the EU Data Act contains three key mechanisms: direct data access, an indirect data access claim for users, and a derived data sharing claim for third parties. To enable direct data access, Article 3 of the EU Data Act introduces the principle of data accessibility by design. According to this principle, IoT devices must be designed and manufactured in such a manner that the IoT data they collect is easily, securely, and free of charge accessible to users. This access must be provided in a comprehensive, structured, commonly used, and machine-readable format. Additionally, IoT data should be directly accessible, for example, via an interface or the product's data storage. However, the obligation to ensure data accessibility by design is subject to a restriction. Direct data access only needs to be provided where relevant and technically feasible. This raises the question of how Article 3 of the EU Data Act relates to the data access claim under Article 4, and whether manufacturers have a right to choose in this regard. But more on that in a moment. The second mechanism is set out in Article 4 of the EU Data Act as the user's claim to access their IoT data against the data holder. This right applies when the user cannot access the data directly. If they do not have direct access to the data as defined in Article 3 of the EU Data Act, they can claim access from the data holder, who will typically be the manufacturer. Upon a simple request of the user, the data holder must provide any readily available IoT data. This refers to data that the data holder can access without making a disproportionate effort. As data access under Article 4 of the EU Data Act is based on a claim rather than being purely factual, as under Article 3, questions arise as to the relationship between the data holder and the user. Firstly, the data holder must check whether the claimant is an authorized user. However, no information beyond what is necessary may be requested for this purpose. One possible solution would be to set up customer accounts. Furthermore, although data access must be free of charge, it may be restricted or even denied under certain conditions. In addition, users are subject to restrictions on use. We will discuss these in detail in future episodes. Let's take another look at the relationship between Articles 3 and 4 of the EU Data Act. Specifically, the question is whether the manufacturer has the right to offer access via Article 4 of the EU Data Act, even if direct access could be provided under Article 3 of the EU Data Act. While the law is not entirely clear on this point, the European Commission assumes that manufacturers can opt for opening the data access claim instead of direct data access. This may be particularly appealing to manufacturers because Article 4 of the EU Data Act provides more regulatory options, giving manufacturers greater control. The third mechanism is the derived data sharing claim for third parties under Article 5 of the EU Data Act. In order to enable commercial use of the data, users may request that their data not be provided to them but to a third party. If the user or a third party acting on their behalf requests it, the data holder must share the user's data with the third party. The data sharing claim for the third party reflects the user's claim under Article 4 of the EU Data Act, but with some specifications. In particular, unlike in the case of the user, the data does not have to be provided to the third party free of charge. Instead, the data sharing conditions introduced in Articles 8 and 9 of the EU Data Act apply. Further specifications also relate to data access restrictions, which we will discuss in more detail in the next episodes. To wrap up, here are the key takeaways from this episode of our new series, Data Act Unlocked. In order to enable users of IoT devices to access the data generated through their use and to allow them to use it commercially, the EU Data Act contains three mechanisms. The first is data accessibility by design, as set out in Article 3 of the EU Data Act. This means that products must be designed in such a manner that users can access the data directly via the product itself. The second mechanism is indirect access under Article 4 of the EU Data Act, which comes into play when direct access is not possible. In this case, the data holder must provide the data to the user upon request. Access is free of charge, but restrictions may apply. Thirdly, users may request that data holders share the data with third parties, as set out in Article 5 of the EU Data Act. This access reflects the user's own data access claim, but has a few special features. In particular, the data does not have to be provided free of charge. We're glad to have you following our series Data Act Unlocked. For more insights, check out #CMS Data Law or visit our website.